Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I'd like to welcome all of you who've joined us today for this webinar. You may be familiar with our campaign already, or you may be joining us for the first time today. Just to let you know that our Twitter handle is @ScotlandModel, and I'd like to also point you to our website, which is www.amodelforscotland.org. You can find other information, how you can get involved, as well as being able to access all of our webinars. My name is Diane Martin, and I'm a practitioner, having supported women to exit prostitution for over 25 years. I am a vice chair of ODIHR's ISTAC, the International Survivors of Trafficking Advisory Council, and I'm also a survivor of prostitution in the UK and of trafficking abroad. So, Modal Eisen Alaba, a model for Scotland, is an alliance of survivors organisations and frontline service providers calling for a progressive legal model to combat commercial sexual exploitation in Scotland. The campaign is calling on the Scottish Government to reform Scotland's outdated and unjust prostitution laws via the following measures. Excuse me, to decriminalise victims of sexual exploitation and provide comprehensive resourced support and exiting services for victims of sexual exploitation, wipe previous convictions for soliciting from victims' criminal records, to criminalise paying for sex, and to criminalise online pimping websites. The Scottish Government recognises prostitution as a form of violence against women. And in its programme for government 2021-22, the government has committed to develop a model for Scotland which effectively tackles and challenges men's demand for prostitution. This webinar will explore what the Scottish Government will need to do to effectively tackle men's demand for prostitution. So, men who pay for sex, that's been an area largely ignored until relatively recently. With the exception of some progressive countries outside of the UK and some areas faced with the realities of the harms intrinsic in prostitution within the UK, that called out for a shift in focus. It's what has been the ignored area, the demand, the men who create the demand of entitled men that insists on a subset of women and children, nearly always funneled from a life experience of multiple disadvantage to meet that demand. So in the same way that we want to see the criminal burden shifted from those exploited onto those who create the demand and those who supply it and those who advertise it on pimping websites, we also need to shine the spotlight on those very men in conversations we have about prostitution in society, because we need a massive culture shift if we're serious about addressing all forms of violence against women and girls and anyone exploited through prostitution. We know that men who pay for sex have an increased propensity for violence. It is a red flag. The police officer who recently kidnapped and murdered Sarah Everard was also a sex buyer who didn't even try to hide it, even taking an escort to a police social event. Many of his colleagues also knew. The demand for prostitution needs to be tackled in Scotland. And today you're going to hear why we need to do that and how we can implement that approach. As a professional who's had the privilege of supporting women to exit prostitution for over 25 years, I have worked very closely with a number of partner agencies across all sectors, including those represented here today by our speakers, in order to develop and improve services and policies to support those exit pathways and to ensure that they were sustainable. And as a survivor of prostitution in the UK and of being trafficked abroad, there is a special place in my heart for the men who fight for those exploited and who fight against those who exploit. whatever context they are fighting in, be it criminal justice, health and social care, parliament, or any other arena. Speaking for myself, although we have had this same sentiment echoed by many, many other survivors who agreed that as the exploitation, violence, and entitlement was done at the hands of men, there is something powerful, transformative, and healing when I encounter and witness men who just get it, who see the realities of prostitution and respond with action to be part of that same solution. You are going to hear from some of them today and one of them right now. So to start us off, I am delighted to introduce to you Valiant Richey, who is the OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Human Beings. He represents the OSCE at the political level on anti-trafficking issues and assists the 57 OSCE participating states in the development and implementation of anti-trafficking strategies and initiatives. Previous to this, Val worked for 13 years as a prosecutor in Seattle, handling sexual assault, child exploitation, and human trafficking cases. He led a coalition of law enforcement, NGOs, academics, service providers, philanthropists, and policymakers focused on the eradication of commercial sexual exploitation and trafficking in Washington state. Val, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Diane, for that great presentation, but also for your opening remarks, because I can absolutely agree that engaging men is really crucial for this effort. So thanks so much for the invitation to join this. Today, I'm going to talk about addressing demand as it relates to trafficking, because trafficking is the perspective that the OSCE brings to this conversation. But I think you're going to see a lot of complementarity and parallels between the discussion about demand as it relates to trafficking and the demand related to prostitution. So what I'm going to talk about is why I think we should address demand and how I think we should address demand, which are two kind of fundamental questions here. And what I'd like to do, if it's okay, is share a few slides, which I think will help visually represent some of the ideas I'm going to talk about. First of all, when we're talking about why we should address demand, if we want to try to end trafficking for sexual exploitation, one of the reasons is because we need to undermine the financial motivations of trafficking for sexual exploitation. We need to make it not a profitable business to exploit people for sex. And trafficking is, in fact, a financially motivated crime. And the profits from it are increasing, unfortunately. But oftentimes we talk about this just from the perspective of who's earning the money. And we don't talk about the fact that while traffickers are earning $99 billion a year off this, it's being paid by buyers. And it's being paid by buyers who knowingly or unknowingly are buying sex. And the knowingly or unknowingly is crucial because it broadens the conversation beyond this idea of just buying sex from a trafficking victim to buying sex generally, and trafficking is what happens in response to that. The second reason is harm, and this is really important because what demand does is it incentivizes traffickers to commit the harms that they commit. So for example, when a trafficker uses force or coercion or deceit to exploit somebody, the reason the trafficker is doing that is because they know they can make money from buyers. And if we want to stop that harm that traffickers are causing, we need to address demand. The second reason is because demand, and here I'm talking about sex purchases specifically, cause direct harm to victims through the sex act. And what I mean by this is that persons who are trafficked into sexual exploitation are not entering that situation voluntarily. Right? So they are entering it as a result of having been coerced or forced into it. And what that means is that it means that buying sex from a trafficking victim doesn't just incentivize exploitation, it is exploitation in and of itself. And this is a crucial fact to I think, recognize. Now, Scotland has taken that even, I think, a step further by recognizing that the purchase of sex from anyone is a form of violence. And I think that's really consistent with what I'm trying to talk about here, which is what is the circumstance of the person who's from whom sex is being purchased. I think we always need to take that into account. And finally, we know that oftentimes these acts are supplemented with additional violence, and along the lines of something relatively minor to homicide, as Diane was just talking about. Third, we need to address it because of gender and racial discrimination. We know that 92% of victims are women and girls, not only women and girls, of course, but it is vastly and disproportionately gendered. And it affects minority women and girls in particular. And what that means is that vulnerability is intersectional, but privilege is homogenous. And what I mean by that is the people buying are universally men, and they're almost always white men and privileged white men. And this was borne out in my own personal experience back in Seattle when we did a lot of research around this, and we found that nearly half of the identified child victims of trafficking were Black. Half, and they only represented 6% of the population. Meanwhile, 71% of the buyers were white men, disproportionately high for that area. That tells us that this is a system of oppressing vulnerable people by privileged and more powerful people. And that is something that we have to, I think, take very, very close examination of when we're talking about whether this is a system we should allow to continue. Third, it's an untapped resource. And what I mean by that is that countries are not winning the battle against exploitation right now. And almost universally, countries are not aggressively addressing demand. And I think those two things go hand in hand. If we want to turn the tide on exploitation, we need to address demand and switch from being reactive, prosecuting cases, trying to help victims after the fact, to being proactive, preventing the industry from even getting off the ground. Also, I'll note that addressing demand is a requirement under international law, and that's not something we should forget. Countries are required to be doing this, and that's absolutely where what we should remind our policymakers of. So how can states address demand? The first thing I think what they need to do is establish demand, addressing demand as a pillar of their national action plan. This cannot be a side project. This needs to be core, front and center in terms of how we need to end exploitation. Second of all, we need to develop a holistic approach. That means engaging everything from early childhood education to strong policies and codes of conduct in the workplace, to awareness campaigns, and to criminal justice laws. I think we need to put all of these things together because, as Diane said, this is a cultural problem, so we need to solve it from a cultural perspective. And we need to heavily invest in prevention, from education programs of both youth and sex buyers, to employer codes of conduct, to online deterrence and disruption, including of websites where this is happening. And I commend the Scottish Parliament for the recent report around online pimping, because I think it was spot on in that it addressed the venues where demand flourishes and how it can accelerate exploitation. And we need more effective criminal justice measures. As Diane just articulated, one of those is to hold people who buy sex generally and from trafficking victims accountable for what they're doing. Now, the crucial piece here is that criminal justice alone is not going to solve this problem, but it serves a very important function in setting a norm against conduct. We have to stand up and say this conduct is not acceptable. And one way we do that is by setting laws and policies against it. It sends a very strong message from society that this is not okay. And that's a crucial piece of this. The second thing is laws don't implement themselves. So you can have the best laws in the world, but if you don't implement them through resources and political will and expertise, then it won't work. And this is a fundamental thing that I think will have to be considered as Scotland moves forward. What I'd like to do is stop there and just highlight that we have a paper that we just released this summer, which discusses all these different types of interventions. And I just want to highlight it for you because I think it can be a really good policy guide and intervention guide for countries as they start to build their plans going forward. So thank you again so much for the invitation. Diane, thanks so much for the opportunity to work with you. I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Val, for that comprehensive and clear presentation. And thank you for reminding us of the intersectionality relating to those exploited, and that privilege is indeed homogenous, and as well as highlighting a requirement to adhere to international law. Now we're moving on to our next speaker, and I'm delighted to introduce you to Heather Williams. Heather has a wealth of experience in the women's sector in Scotland and has worked in the violence against women sector for 20 years at both a national and a local level in management and frontline support roles. She's the national coordinator of the Women's Support Project, with a focus on commercial sexual exploitation in Glasgow, a project that works to raise awareness of the extent, causes and effects of male violence against women, and for improved services for those affected by violence. One of its main areas of work being to raise awareness of the harmful impact of commercial sexual exploitation, to provide services and signpost women to specialist services, and to highlight male demand as the root cause. Heather, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Diane. Thanks for that introduction. In terms of, why is that not, hold on, sorry. I'll try again to share my screen. You'd think after 2 and a bit years I'd be used to doing this now, wouldn't you? Let's see, try again. Sorry, Diane, give me 2 seconds. There we go. Okay. Okay, so as I was saying, thanks very much, Diane, for that invite. I'm going to be speaking this afternoon about some work that was carried out by the Women's Support Project back in 2006-07 by Jan McLeod and some of her colleagues, which looked at, spoke to men who bought sex in Scotland, and also be using some of the more up-to-date research that's been carried out about men who pay for sex, to look at what we know about them, but also what they tell us about what would stop them from paying for sex. So in terms of who are the men that pay for sex, I've got some pictures here from a piece of work that was carried out in Germany by Bettina Flittner, who spent 10 days in Paradise, a brothel in Germany, where she spoke to men who were buying sex and took photographs of them. And often in the media, we are led to believe that men who purchase sex are, you know, sad, lonely, you know, kind of isolated men who are sexually inactive. But the reality is that what we know from research is that it's estimated that in Scotland, between kind of or in the UK, between 4% and 12% of men are reported to have bought sex in the last 5 years. I believe that those estimates are underestimates, because obviously not everyone is going to admit to having purchased sex, but though what we know about men who buy sex is that, well, there's a great amount of variability in the men who purchase sex, is that typically the average age of men who purchase sex is between 33 and 41, that they tend to be in employment, and that about 50% of men will be in stable relationships, that they are this idea that it's men who are unable to get sex any other way, or the men who buy sex is actually not. They're ordinary men. They're like, some of the men who are in this audience, they're men who are part of society. There's very little difference between men who buy sex and men who don't buy sex, other than attitudes towards their attitudes towards women in general. So the data data that we have is that about 50% of men who buy sex are married or in a stable relationship, and that they are they tend to be, as I say, within that kind of between 33-41 kind of age bracket. But we know that from research that men typically first visit or first buy sex in their mid-20s. Some of you may have seen that Police Scotland have recently launched their Don't Be That Guy campaign. And one of the things that I think we could have put in that is don't be that guy that encourages your friends and peers to buy sex, because what the research tells us about men who buy sex is that actually on their first occasion is that they're encouraged by peers and friends to do so. And in fact, the research that was carried out by the Women's Support Project showed that about 41% of the men that were interviewed actually were with friends when they first bought sex. So in terms of kind of challenging those attitudes and challenging that demand, we perhaps could use that Don't Be That Guy campaign to challenge some of the ideas around that as well. In terms of the research that was carried out by the Women's Support Project and was and it's been carried out into men who buy sex, the kind of motivations that are used, or the justifications that are used for paying for sex, include the desire for sexual variety, so having sex with a variety of partners, dissatisfaction with existing relationships, so basically for men who are in stable relationships that their partners don't provide them with enough sex or the kind of sex that they want, that it's about sexual gratification, that sometimes it can be about loneliness, shyness or incapacities, about men not having any other sexual outlets, about being separated from a partner by travel, and that idea of curiosity, risk or excitement. These quotes that we've put up here are some of the quotes that were gathered through that research from men in Scotland about why they purchased, why they bought sex. And as you'll see, that often these justifications draw on that idea of that biological imperative that men have to have sex. That they can't control themselves, and that basically that it's something that they have to do, and that it's about that release, relaxation, and that by paying for sex they're able to have the type of sex that they want to have, that they may not be comfortable asking someone that they're in a stable relationship with for. And through the kind of attitudes that we see from the research that's been done with men that buy sex, is that often the men who buy sex will separate women who sell sex and women who don't sell sex into very distinct groups, and that women who don't sell sex are good women, and that women who do sell sex are somehow othered, and therefore they're able to ask them to do things that they wouldn't necessarily ask their partners to do. I think also we see from the research that men who buy sex, that it's linked to this idea of we live in a consumer society, that women are seen as objects, as sexual objects, as commodities that can be bought, and that provides a context within which commercial sex is normalised. But it's also associated with entitlements and what Valiant was talking about in terms of who buys sex, and that power and privilege that is there basically. That when you have enough money, you can buy whatever and whoever you want. But also what we see from men who buy sex, who speak about why they buy sex, you see this idea that somehow or other buying sex is easier than having a relationship, that putting that time and effort into it. So it's an immediate gratification basically. that some of the quotes that we see, some of the ideas that we see is that, you know, if I have to take a woman out for a meal, I'm not guaranteed to have sex. Whereas if I, you know, pay for it, I know what I'm going to get at the end of, you know, at the end of it, basically. So that idea very much of, you know, that women as commodities, women as sexual objects, is absolutely something that we see come through in terms of those attitudes as well. And ultimately what we see as well is that idea of male entitlement. So this quote that I've got here comes from some research that was carried out in relation to motivations of men who pay for sex. And this came from Oliver, who basically, when he's sexually disappointed in his marriage, he feels justified in seeking out paid for sex. He equates sexual access to his wife as being a husband, despite her reluctance. And we see that idea that, you know, that men have sexual needs that their partner maybe isn't meeting, and somehow that's unfair, and therefore they're justified and entitled to pay for sex and to seek sex out with the marriage, if you like, and we see very much that idea of that masculine right to obtain sex, and to basically to pay for it if they're not getting it within the relationship. We also very much from the justifications that men use about why they buy sex is this idea that somehow or other that buying sex is seen as rape prevention, basically. That this idea that in terms of those myths, if you like, that are out there, that somehow or other men can't control themselves, that they have to have sex, that somehow their animalistic urges basically have to be, you know, kind of followed through in some way or another. And if they weren't paying for sex, that basically they would be tempted to commit sexual crimes. In terms of the challenging men's demand research, you know, that basically these are some quotes from some of the men that were involved in that, and you see that idea of that kind of rape prevention that kind of follow through there, but also we very much see that idea of you know, men telling us that actually they will ask you know, women who are selling sex to perform certain sex acts that they wouldn't ask their regular partner to do. And this idea, I suppose, of men as you know, being driven by these biological needs and not being able to help themselves, is I suppose it's you know, it's an absolute kind of fallacy, but it is absolutely intrinsic to how we understand you know, both rape in terms of rape myths, but also in terms of the idea of why men buy sex. And I suppose to me, one of the things when I read this or hear this is it kind of is that we do men such a disservice at this idea that somehow they can't control themselves, that they are, you know, driven by these you know, biological urges basically, and they can't do anything about it. And it's such a disservice to men as a whole to actually to hold that view, but also to think that somehow or other that excuses behaviour that is harmful to others. And we also saw through the challenge and demand research that link to kind of exploitation, as well as this was some research that was carried out, and the quotes that I've got here was research that was carried out most recently in London and Tower Hamlets, which very much showed that men were aware of that exploitation, and that actually didn't stop them. It didn't change their behaviour, and it didn't change their attitudes. And the challenge and demand research, 28% of the men that were interviewed in Scotland reported that they had they had bought sex from a woman where they knew that she was under the control of a pimp, and 42% had said that they had observed a woman who had been selling sex who had a pimp. that goes kind of hand in hand, and that they didn't have any kind of issue with that. It didn't stop them. It didn't make them think about whether that woman wanted to be there, whether she wanted to be, whether she wanted to be doing what she was involved in. And research carried out by the University of Leicester also showed that basically about 25% had encountered situations where women who were selling sex had been exploited at least once, with some men encountering this on a regular basis. So this idea that men being aware of exploitation will somehow stop them, it actually isn't borne out by men's words themselves in terms of that situation. What men do tell us, though, about what will stop them and what will change their behaviours is basically as if they thought that there was going to be legal consequences from it, if they thought that people were going to find out about it, and if that was to be enforced. And that's the thing that comes very much from what men who buy sex tell us about what would deter them from buying sex, is that actual legislation needs to be enforced. If I thought I was going to get caught, I wouldn't like to get caught, but I'll go on. The lack of probability of getting caught means that I continue to do this, that I continue to buy sex. And the figures there from the research that was carried out with men in Scotland was that 89% said that they would stop if they were going to be added to the sex offender registry, 86% if they were going to have their picture or name on a billboard, 84% if they were going to have their picture or name in a local newspaper. So those types of criminalisation, if you like, where there's consequences for men, where they are their behaviour is becomes seen and visible to the community, is what men who buy sex tell us would make a difference. And this slide here shows some information from the research that was carried out by the University of Leicester, where over 50% of men said that they would definitely, probably or possibly change their behaviour if a law was introduced that made it a crime to pay for sex. So we know from men's accounts, we know from what men tell us, that changing the legislation, that criminalising that behaviour would actually have an impact on demand. And we know that that as long as there's dubiety about it, as long as it's seen as okay, as long as legislation isn't enforced, and as long as we have a society that I suppose gives messages that men are entitled to sex, and that women are commodities and objects, then actually there are issues there that need to be addressed. And from this research, what men are telling us is one way of being able to address that and to challenge that demand is to change the law and to make it illegal to pay for sex. I'll leave it there, Diane, thanks.
Oh, thank you so much, Heather. It's sobering indeed when we focus and shine a spotlight on the men who pay for sex and who they are and what they think. I'm reminded of, is it Punternet? I never go on and look at that. I find it so upsetting, where sex buyers put reviews about women that they've paid for. And I remember sometimes, the men will say, oh, we don't know that they're exploited or trafficked. And I remember one review that was complaining and saying, she was rubbish and she cried the whole time and I should have got my money back. And that just tells you so much about many of the men engaging in that was their reaction, was in someone crying through the whole ordeal, was to just be focused on getting their money back. And also a lot of times it's described as fantasy, and it's certainly not fantasy for the minds and bodies of the women on the receiving end. I think also too, we can't forget about the effect of pornography, where unfortunately many of our young people cite as a source about how they learn about sex. And in Scotland, we like to think of ourselves as a progressive society, but as long as we allow this abuse to continue, we are anything but progressive. So we've got the policy, but we need to see that policy enacted because it's getting worse and the markets are growing. But what we do know is that where the approach and model for Scotland is calling for has been implemented, the demand is reduced and those exploited can be supported to exit and the culture can change. So I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker, who is Alan Caton, OBE. Alan is a former detective superintendent of Suffolk Constabulary, and he served as a police officer for 30 years. He achieved national recognition when in 2006 he co-wrote the prostitution strategy and led the multi-agency response to tackle street prostitution in Ipswich after the tragic murders of 5 young women. The strategy has been hugely successful, along with being instrumental in assisting other police forces and local authorities to address prostitution and support women to exit. In 2012, Alan was awarded an OBE by Her Majesty the Queen for his services to policing. Following his retirement, Alan was appointed as independent chair of Islington and Central Bedfordshire Safeguarding Children Boards, a role that sees him coordinate the efforts of all the agencies represented on the board to achieve safeguarding and to ensure that children and young people are being successfully protected within the wider partnership. How I met Alan is when, probably about 5 years ago, when we were both members of an independent commission on the sex buyer law, where we visited Sweden and then analysed how reforms to prostitution laws could practically be implemented in the UK. It's always a pleasure to work alongside Alan. And Alan, the floor is yours. You're on mute.
I've just unmuted myself, Diane, I think, unless someone else was going to do it. No, thank you. And thank you, Diane, for that warm introduction and nice to see you. And thank you for inviting me today. As Diane says, I'm going to talk a bit about my experience in Ipswich. And it was always an opportunity to remember those young women who very sadly died at the hands of a sex buyer in Ipswich in the winter of 2006. And whilst, of course, it's a hugely complex subject and lots of activity was ongoing, I haven't got long today, so I will focus on the demand side of the work that we had done. But just to give you a brief overview, after the murders, it was decided that there would need to be a strategy to deal with the issue of prostitution. And strategically and politically, we wanted to remove street prostitution from the streets of Ipswich. And that was a task that was given to me to write. And I go back to what Val was saying right at the beginning. This is not a one agency issue. This is a multi-agency, everybody's involved to make this work issue. But I was, I worked with colleagues from the local authority, from the county council, from drug services, from health services, and we drafted a 5-pronged strategy. And very briefly, the strategy was about really getting to understand the problem in Ipswich as it appertained to prostitution. It was about tackling the demand for prostitution. I'll come back to that. It was about prevention. And again, Val mentioned that right at the beginning. It's imperative that we prevent the next generation entering into that harmful activity. It was about developing routes out and working with each of the individual women involved in street prostitution and providing tailor-made services to help them exit. It was about engaging with the communities where this all took place. But if I can just focus on perhaps the 3 key issues. I mean, the experience told us a lot about the women that were involved. And as Val and as Heather said earlier, it was predominantly, women who were selling sex, and it was predominantly men who were buying it. There were some men who were selling sex, but again, the common denominator is that it was men who were buying that sex. So we need to put this down as purely a man issue that we need to tackle. I'd been involved in policing, as Diane said, for over 30 years. I was a detective sergeant in the 1980s. Prostitution strategy then was around enforcement and arresting the women. And of course, I knew from back then that was never really an option that worked. It was seen to be a police-only activity. It was a, you know, it might stop things or calm things down for a little while, but the women would go and get fined. They would, of course, come back out on the street to continue to sell sex. And the dynamics of prostitution changed in Ipswich over those years. And in the sort of the 2000s, it was predominantly to fuel drug addiction and coerced by partners to go on the streets to get the money to get the drugs that were needed, for the women, as I've since found out, to enable them to do what they were doing. So we knew a lot about the women. We knew how vulnerable they were. We knew what chaotic lives they led. We knew also a lot about the men. And it comes back to the point that Heather was making. You know, these men were not sort of sad, lonely, sexually inactive men. These were ordinarily, you know, men who were married in long-term relationships, had children. So, you know, it doesn't fit that sort of stereotypical view of a man who is sad and lonely. But so, you know, once we drafted the strategy and we had to enforce it, getting political buy-in and buy-in from all of the agencies was key to this. And I spent a lot of time going around speaking to, you know, boards and governance bodies about what we wanted to do and why we wanted to do it. And it was saying we're not going to accept the status quo. We needed to do things differently. And it was, in effect, adopting a Nordic model style of policing and activity to tackle the demand, to help women exit and to prevent that next generation entering. And it was putting all that together at the same time that was the key to the success of what happened in Ipswich. So tackling the demand, very briefly, was a police-led focus. It was on tackling the demand for men who bought sex either on foot or in cars, curb crawling. We could only use the legislation that was available to us. So we had to work in the legislative framework of the country at this moment in time, because, as we know, and the selling of sex in itself is not illegal, the buying of sex is not illegal, it's the activities around it. But we need to strengthen that, and this is what we're trying to articulate today. So in order to use the law, we came down on hard on all the men who were buying sex. So every man that was caught curb crawling or buying sex on foot was arrested, was taken to the police station, had their fingerprints taken, had their DNA taken, had their photograph taken. This strong zero tolerance led approach really did change men's behaviour. Clearly in Ipswich it was highly publicised in the newspapers. We took a very strong stance not to name and shame, mainly because the impact that would have on the women and children of the men who were being named and shamed, which would be detrimental to them. So we didn't go down that route, despite the press asking us to. But when men were charged and going to court, obviously it was all over the newspapers. And sadly, and I don't suppose it will be a surprise to many of you, a Metropolitan Police officer was somebody who was caught during that campaign in Ipswich, a serving Metropolitan Police officer. And I'm still perplexed to this day why that officer did not lose his job for that and being found guilty of that crime. And other things have subsequently happened, which perhaps means we're not as surprised. And there's cultures in the police service about how it deals with men who treat women in that way that needs to be addressed as well. And I think after the most recent events that will be being addressed. So taking that zero tolerance approach and at the same time working very closely with the women, with a multi-agency team, working with individual women, tailoring support needs, be it around health services, drug addiction, housing needs, education, access to their children. You know, it wasn't just a straightforward, signpost to drug addiction. It was really working with these women individually, understanding what their needs were and providing them with services that would help them exit. And over time, because I know I'm running out of time here, Diane, we had the strategy evaluated independently, because I wanted to know if this was making a difference, if we were doing something that was going to, as I was being told all the time, just drive it further underground by targeting the demand. But no, the University of East Anglia, who did the research, they found that actually we did deter men, we did change their behaviour, we did help women exit and effectively eradicated street prostitution from the streets of Ipswich. Clearly, I think, going back to Val's comments, that the demand, people say, well, trafficking is not linked to it. Of course it's linked to it. In this country and in Scotland and in England, the demand is there. Men feel they can buy sex with impunity, and we need to really challenge that. And that will absolutely have a detrimental impact on those organised criminal gangs who, let's face it, make huge sums of money through trafficking and bringing women into England and into Scotland for the purposes of selling sex. Clearly a very, very complicated and very, very lengthy strategy. I could talk about it forever, Diane, but that just gives, I think, a flavour of the work that we had done. And I think it just in a microcosm of implementing that sort of strategy about tackling the demand, helping women exit, the success in Ipswich shows that that approach really can make a difference and really can work. And I would sort of implore everybody to adopt that approach to help women exit and to change men's attitude towards women and girls. Thank you, Diane.
Oh, thank you so much, Alan. And I could listen to you all day talking about the work that you've done. Thank you for highlighting prevention and also for highlighting the multi-agency approach that's necessary with wraparound services. And I think part of what was a really good example of what happened in Ipswich is that it was resourced. And so you were able to really take that holistic approach in supporting the women and also then addressing the demand. And, what you were saying really, again, highlights the need for legislative change, because we have in the UK had police and local authorities who have taken this approach. I think of Norwich, I think of Lambeth, I think of Glasgow, but the police and local authorities, as you said, are limited within the legislative framework that exists. And so that's why we need to have the legislation and the policy and to actually implement it, because otherwise it relies on goodwill. And as you know, people move on, and so you cannot end up having to start from scratch. So we really need that, sorry for the buzzword, but we really do need that joined up approach. So moving along, I'm really happy to have Julian Heng here to speak to us today. And Julian is a planning and development manager within the Equality and Human Rights team at NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, with responsibility for a programme of work focused upon gender-based violence. He has an extensive work background within health and social care, and Julian took the position of service manager in August 2006 to found and establish the NHS Open Road Service, which was the NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde service for men involved in prostitution, and the only dedicated service for this population group in the west of Scotland, with a remit to identify, assess and address the health and social needs of men currently or previously involved in prostitution or vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Julian remained in this position until services for women and men involved in prostitution were brought together at Sandyford Sexual Health Services in 2015. Welcome, Julian, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invite to present today, Diane. It's much appreciated. I have a short PowerPoint presentation, which I will share just now. And if the technology doesn't work, I will just continue to speak. Okay, sorry, 2 seconds. Oops. Okay. Apologies, I am just having a little bit of problem with screen size, but I don't want to waste time on a technological problem, so I will just crack on. So the NHS Open Road Service, as Diane has already said, was established in 2006 to identify, assess and address the health and social care needs of men involved in prostitution. And what I really wanted to do today is just give you a very brief snapshot of some observations from the service in terms of the experience of our service users, and also to think about the ideology that was really driving the shape of the service, the direction that we took, and what that tells us about structural inequalities and the campaign in terms of a model for Scotland. And I think what I would really want to comment on is that it was really interesting that at the time when we established the service, most of the men that we engaged with and who were our service users were involved in street-based prostitution. And so I think in terms of what Open Road was doing, it's slightly different in terms of the focus today, because I'm not really thinking about the purchasers of sex so much as an actual group of men who were exploited and involved in prostitution themselves. And at that time, that group of men were mostly involved in street-based prostitution. We had quite a wide age range of service users from their 20s through to their 50s. Interestingly, also, the sexual orientation of those men was fairly equally split between men who identified as heterosexual and men who identified as gay or bisexual. And actually, the commonality, the common theme with our service users was that all of those men had experienced poverty and destitution, and their involvement in prostitution was very much framed as survival sex. There was no one who was involved in prostitution because it was a positive choice in terms of how they expressed their sexual identity. All of the purchasers and that marketplace driving the demand was all male sex buyers, and it in no way correlated then to the sexual orientation of that man who was involved in prostitution. Their common factor, as I say, was their experience of poverty or destitution. And interestingly, a lot of the men that we would work with would sort of frame that experience in terms of almost an altruistic sense of, this is a victimless crime, because myself as the person involved in prostitution, I'm the only person that gets hurt, whereas if my solution to poverty and destitution was a different form of criminality, such as petty theft, for example, there would be someone else in that paradigm that would get hurt. Whereas myself involved in prostitution, it feels like a victimless crime because I'm the only one that's exposed to danger or harm via this. So thinking then about how we would define prostitution for that group of men who were involved in prostitution, men who were involved in sexual activity in exchange for some form of payment, which most commonly was money, but could be various different forms of transaction. And it could take place in a variety of different settings. And as I said at the start of the project's life, the kind of 10-year lifespan of Open Road, we really started off supporting men involved in street-based prostitution. And I think what we observed was a gradual shift over to men becoming involved on escorting websites, where there was perhaps some sense of being a little bit more in control as opposed to being on street and being curb crawled. But then I think what our service users would subsequently report back to us is the vast array of unpredictable events that could still arise in terms of the transaction happening within an escorting website, but then the dangers were still there in terms of actually having to meet up with that sex buyer. That sense of escorting from a website being a safer choice was really a bit of an illusion, and actually the core experience was still much the same. I think, interestingly, though, what we also observed throughout the life of the service was an increase in referrals to support teenage males who were care experienced and at the point of leaving care. And as I say, all of our service users highlighted the fact that the purchasers of sex were always male. Service users' detailed experience, which suggested that many purchasers were adept at seeking out individuals who had vulnerabilities that could be exploited. And I think this was the point really where we were seeing an increasing number of referrals for care leavers, because sex buyers were able to perceive that as a vulnerability that they could exploit. And as I say, towards the end of the project's life, increasingly it was care leavers who we were working with. So in terms of what's the ideology, what's our policy position, what is it we're trying to achieve? And I think on a wider sense, you know, we could take some direction from the Scottish Government Sexual Health and Bloodborne Virus Framework, which really requests that we think about the creation of a culture which is free from coercion and harm, and where people can enter into sexual relationships with enthusiastic consent, and where there's a mutuality within that relationship and not an imbalance in the power dynamics. And I think if we think about some of the public discourse around about prostitution, there's often a bit of a kind of discourse and a tension between, from one position, a bit of an ideal of some sense of bodily autonomy or personal autonomy, and at the other hand, concepts of vulnerability and harm. And often we're sort of pushed and pulled between these two sort of polar positions of individuals have the right to do with their body what they please, and at the other end of that kind of continuum, a recognition that this is a harmful behaviour, and actually, if it's harmful, can you actually consent to your own harm? And I think when we really apply that Scottish Government direction in terms of what does a healthy sexual relationship look like, we really have to ask ourselves, is it ever permissible for a financial transaction to be attached to a sexual act? It fundamentally brings in a power imbalance and alters that relationship. And so I think, sorry to kind of throw so many kind of concepts into the mix all at the one time, but I think if we then also think about that ideology and think about, well, social bargaining in terms of health and social policy, we're always having to consider some element of social bargaining. So if we accept that there is a spectrum of experience, shouldn't we still direct policies and services towards the most vulnerable, marginalised and negatively affected by that experience? And if the core harm from involvement in prostitution is repeatedly having to submit to unwanted sex, I think we have to ask ourselves, is there actually any way to maintain that behaviour in a way that makes it more safe? I'm not convinced that there is. I think the solution is to think about criminalising the sex buyer and offering support for the person involved in prostitution to exit. I think ultimately that's the only way to make that a safer experience. So I won't spend too long on the continuum of gender-based violence, other than to say that all of these various different experiences can be linked, and sometimes can be both an antecedent to involvement in prostitution and sometimes can be a consequence of involvement in prostitution. Going back really to the very first slide, as I say, many of our service users detailed history of having witnessed domestic abuse in the home as a child, of having experienced sexual assault, of having gone through the care system, very early entry into the homelessness arena, and then experience of drug and alcohol services. And I think that experience of rape and sexual assault, childhood sexual abuse, sexual harassment, domestic abuse, all of these experiences are interlinked when we think about involvement in prostitution. So sorry, I appreciate I am now running over time, and I'll make this very quick. But it was really I'll just lightly touch on this slide because it's one of my favourite sort of descriptions of what is it we're trying to achieve here. It's not an academic quote. It's not from a research paper. It's from a columnist who I think kind of summed up a lot of what we're trying to achieve here by saying, you know, I wish it was more complicated to explain what feminism is, because then perhaps more people would be able to understand it, but it's really simple. It's just a belief in gender equality. There are complications, but the reason it's got a special name is because equality is not the human race's default position. And I think this is part of the kind of the social bargaining. It's the levelling up. What do we need to do here to actually improve the situation for those who are most marginalised, so they're not exposed to such a high level of trauma and harm? And I think providing a service for men who are involved in prostitution, we would often be asked, why is this gender-based violence? You know, if it's men who are experiencing prostitution, why are you still framing this as gender-based violence? And really it's because the purchasers of sexual acts were always male. It highlights that structural inequality, privilege and dominance. And ultimately it's still about the exploitation of individuals who are being disadvantaged because of their economic situation or because of any other vulnerability that the sex buyer could take advantage of. But interestingly, although the sexual orientation or sexual identity of our service users was often split, roughly 50-50, as I say, between men who identified as heterosexual and men who identified as gay or bisexual, all of the men experienced a really high level of homophobia and homophobic attack. And again, this is about structural inequality when we think about gender and that policing of gender roles and expectations of how men should behave. And this then really still ties into structural inequality, sexism, misogyny, homophobia. It's all coming from the same root place. And so really there are shared values, and there were always shared values between the Open Road service and the equivalent service for women involved in prostitution, the Roots Out service in Glasgow. We were both exit-focused services. And it was really about trying to find complementary approaches which reinforce that structured or gendered analysis, that appreciation of the shared core root of sexism, misogyny and homophobia, and that awareness that men can be the victims of gender-based violence that's perpetuated by other men, but also that men need to share that responsibility for challenging and changing our culture in partnership with women and services for women. So yes, I'll leave it there. Apologies that my PowerPoint failed and I wasn't in the correct display mode, but hopefully that all still made sense. And as I say, thank you for your time and for listening.
Oops. Am I back? Can you hear me? Okay. I'm unmuted. Great. Julian, thank you so much. What you described was so similar to the women I supported to exit from street-based prostitution in London. And I was thinking about what you said about how they said, oh, you know, I'm doing this because I'm not hurting anyone else. And it's heartbreaking to think that the people we both supported thought it was okay for themselves to be harmed. And I think that says a lot about what probably came before involvement in prostitution. But when you're exploited through survival sex, you have to try and survive mentally and have some kind of a framework for coping. Care leavers is such a crucial issue, and experienced the same thing when the care stopped, and there was just nothing in place. And like you said, the sex buyers who, yes, were all male, looked for vulnerability. I'm so glad that we've moved on from only providing sexual health services for men and women exploited through prostitution. And yes, I totally agree with you that the vulnerable and the exploited are the very population that policy should be based on. Thank you for all your work, and thank you for what you shared with us today. Okay, we've gone over 5 minutes, which is actually less than we usually do. So I'd just like to say thank you so much to everyone that's participated today. This is a subject that we will come back to because we've only kind of looked at, kind of the who and how we can kind of address it. I think there's much wider conversations to have. And I think one or maybe more of our webinars in the future will definitely continue this important conversation. So thank you so much. You're all free to go. And again, please check out our website. To everyone listening, male and female, please get involved. We've got very easy ways that you can see on the website how you can get in touch with your MSPs, and we would love to hear from you. So yes, this is us signing out and saying thank you so much to everyone for joining us today and for such a fantastic panel of speakers. So goodbye from Scotland.